All right, welcome folks to Last Week I Learned. I'm adding a little recording for the newsletter in addition to the deep dive. So not too much extra work and it's fun. So I'm going to do it. Let's start off with our 5 articles from this week. So first up, and I might change the order actually on the newsletter, but this is first up right now, it's titled People Literally Do Not Understand What Laws Are or How They Work. This is a really interesting point about free speech and in particular criminalizing speech. So I think there's a real distinction here between hate speech and dangerous speech and then speech we don't agree with. And this makes a really good example about how careful we should be about that distinction, both on the right and the left. And I think it's really good. It really taught me something about law and made me think about more deeply what it means to make something a law. And so here's a interesting thing I didn't think about, which is, here's the quote, there's often a serious liberal blind spot on gun control. It's easy to think that harsher penalties for gun possession sound desirable, but because of the way policing works, those laws will end up stopping, searching, and the prosecution of more young black men. To be clear, this is not a fantasy. This is what actually happens when stricter gun laws come into effect. So that surprised me. I've been an advocate for stronger gun laws, and I do think less guns mean a safer place. But obviously, I have more thinking to do about how to actually accomplish that because of the way our legal system and policing system works. So this one just gave me food for thought and really helped me get a deeper understanding of laws. Now, it also connects to some reading I've been doing about former British colonies versus former French colonies. And one of the big differences here is, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, is the difference between civil law and common law. And I do not really understand it, but apparently it has big implications for how, like, for example, you register a business. So in common law, I'm trying to remember, there's a great quote, but essentially the assumption is that things are legal unless they're specifically outlined to be illegal. And that makes creating contracts, starting companies much easier. Now, on the flip side, in civil law, which is the case in former French colonies, and I think in France, things are considered illegal unless they're explicitly deemed as legal. So to write up a contract, you generally have to pay more, and it has to be done with a legal entity. Whereas in common law, generally you have like forgiveness until guilty, or I guess innocence until guilty in terms of like other law. So I don't know. I'm trying to learn about laws. They're important. That article really pushed on some of my assumptions, and I hope it does the same for you. Next up is build tools around workflows, not workflows around tools. This one, I have read few articles that hit as close to home for me as this one, not in an emotional way really, but in terms of what I'm trying to do. So, I mean, I've spent probably the better part of the last year building out tools to help me read better information and absorb it better because I didn't like the tools that were out there. So I built, very simple search engine, basically tried to build a way to surface cool articles for myself like social media once did for me. So I resonate a lot with this one. This person has taken it kind of to the next level and has rebuilt like note-taking apps and calendars and all kinds of stuff. I don't think I would ever go that far, but it's really interesting to see someone who did and to just get a look into how they think about this. Now, what I find most interesting is this quote, which I think is really accurate to my experience of like working with tools and part of why I've changed tools so many times. So they say, when we resort to having other people build tools for us, the tools they build might never quite perfectly fit our workflows because they're not built for our individual minds. And I think to add a caveat to this is sometimes you might find a tool that works great and then they change it. And so that was Craft, or they don't change it like you'd want to. So I used to use Craft, which had like this concept of backlink notes and nice markdown, and it was beautiful. And they, instead of going the route of like individual knowledge workers, they tried to go enterprise and team, which makes sense from a startup's perspective. But obviously that's not what I'm using it for. And so it ended up actually not working as a tool, even though initially it looked really good. So really fun, really interesting to see what that person's up to. All right. Next up is, what is partnership for? So I've been single for just over a year. And so I think about dating and what that looks like a fair bit. And I really like this person's perspective on it. I think it's a Substack newsletter called Ava Bear. And I'll read this quote, but they just ask really good questions. And there's a great podcast called the Later Dater Podcast, which is really targeted for people, I think, 40 and up, but I get a ton out of it. It's very interesting. The creator of that podcast ran events for Hinge and is just really thoughtful about what it looks like to date today. But so those are two kind of resources I'm pulling from when I'm thinking about dating. But the quote I want to read you, I think, is pretty emblematic of their thoughts. I'm really reaching for words there. But here it is. My working theory is that maybe marriage is fundamentally about being able to monopolize someone in certain ways while encouraging them still to have an expansive, generative life in other ways. And so the question of who to marry, to me, is maybe about who do you want to have a claim over and what is the nature of that claim. I think this is really well put. I think that more and more today, relationships are not going to fit in a clean box, and they require a lot of thought when it comes to where boundaries are and what they are and for whom. And I think this captures it really well. I think this is the challenge of modern dating, is we have to be more flexible than ever. And there's great benefits to it if you can pull it off, but it's really tricky. And so I have more from her coming at some point, but I wanted to put this one in there. All right, next up, very different. On the humanity. The humanity. Sorry, can't read my H's. This one is about the Humanity pin, that little AI device that launched. And it's kind of confusing because it sounds like maybe it wouldn't be about that. The title is a little unclear. But what I love here is they break down kind of the failure of humanity as, well, I guess when you say it that way, it sounds like all of humanity failed. But they break down the failure of this company as trying to apply Apple's design principles as a startup. And I think this is really fascinating, right? And I think this is really interesting as well, because we don't see a ton of people from Apple starting huge companies. And I think this is why. Like, Apple is often a second mover, and they have tremendous amounts of capital. So in this article, they talk about really what Apple does best is to take something like the Fitbit and make a fancier version of it, or take something like the phone and make a smarter version of it. Right. And so I think curious how they'll do that with the visual virtual reality, right? Because they took Meta's version of the headset and made a better one, but I don't think anyone really ever wanted Meta's version. So I feel like with the phone, they took something that was really popular, or the watch, and made a better version of it. Anyhow, their argument here is that humanity tried made two key mistakes. They tried to launch this product as polished and great like Apple does, and they did it without ever validating this was something people wanted, right? And I think this is just a really interesting example of not validating a market before you launch and trying to build up hype. Like, humanity in some ways was super successful, but they built up a ton of hype. They had a lot of people really interested in what they were doing. They just didn't have a thing that worked. And so I think this quote kind of captures it well, which is, for all we know, maybe they did build prototypes, but convinced themselves it would be solved. There are certain types of problems you can solve at the scale of Apple, but are intractable at this startup. Scaling a startup is about deferring those moonshot bets until your company has the momentum to compete at that scale. So really, it was a problem with size. This was just not, the next iPhone is not a problem that a startup can solve. It was a problem that Apple could solve because they were already an existing company in other markets. And honestly, I think this really sets up OpenAI well. I think it's really interesting to think about, is OpenAI the next one to make, another iPhone? And I think they are working on a hardware device, so it'll be interesting. I do want to keep an eye on them because they have access to cheap capital like few others do. So that is the humanity. Finally, money stuff, a meme stock for private companies. So one of the things that a few thinkers have put on my radar that I find interesting and also concerning is just how really the returns on companies has changed. So it used to be a company would see most of its like growth or financial return post IPO, and that meant retail investors like me would have access to it. But what we're seeing now is basically people are fundraising more and more in the private markets, which means only a much smaller percentage of people get access to it. To be an accredited investor and to be active in the private markets, I think you have to have a net worth of you must make over $200,000 or have a net worth of over $1 million. And there's just not that many people that have that. And so this is kind of concerning to see this shift from, companies growing the valuation after IPO to them growing it before. So you'll see, kind of OpenAI is an example of this. They've raised a bunch of money, but they've done it through private companies and private investors. And so you're seeing more of these rounds. And then generally you might see private equity step in instead of an IPO, or you'd see an acquisition happen instead of an IPO. So it's kind of, in my opinion, not great for the financial markets. Obviously it benefits private investors, but what's really interesting is this kind of stock has stepped in to try to fix this. So they've created an ETF, or maybe it's a mutual fund, I'm not sure which, that buys up stock in private companies because they're an accredited investor and they can do so. So they have stock in SpaceX, and I don't know if they have stock in OpenAI. I don't really understand how OpenAI works, but they have a bunch of private companies. I think Stripe is probably one of them. And they basically sell you a mutual fund or an ETF that's composed of these private companies. So in theory, it gives you access to private markets on a public market. Now, the trick here is it's basically become a meme stock. And because of this pent-up demand for these private companies, I think it's trading at like over 1,000 times revenue, the revenues of the companies versus the valuation of this fund. And so it's insane, but it's interesting because kind of this argument from Matt Levine, the author of this, is that everything's become a meme stock, which is depressing. So not quite sure how we fix this, but I thought it was interesting. And then in that same article, he talks about crypto in a really interesting way. And I'm just going to read the quote because I think he does a great job of laying it out. So the tension he's kind of describing here in the quote is that, crypto is this weird mix of a Wild West and a new regulated financial market, and it's not sure which is which. So what he says is, I'm just saying that you could resolve these disagreements by letting everyone go their separate ways. Have nice crypto, probably the bulk of it, where manipulation is disfavored and government intervention is, at least in theory, welcomed. And have fun crypto for the applied game theorists to play their games against each other. Have a market that makes it explicit in advance on the web page saying that anything you can do on our platform is allowed, and if these results are absurd, then that is fun for you and bad for someone else, and you're on notice. I think this is a great idea. I don't think it's super practical, but crypto is a great place for people to experiment and think things through. That's a great kind of like microcosm of bigger markets. But people also want to use it for real things, and wires get crossed a lot, and scams are common. And I think it's a good idea to think about having kind of this walled garden of crypto where it's like, there's actually rules here, and then have an area of crypto where it's the Wild West and you can try to manipulate the markets or, innovate in some interesting ways. So I know it kind of reminds me of, in some countries, they have cities with less financial regulations. And the idea is that you can maybe get some new configurations or give companies a place, some room to breathe while still having really strict laws in other areas. And you can kind of learn from the less restricted place. And once things look stable, you can pull lessons from it. So interesting, all said. Well, that is all we have, folks. That is our 5 articles for the week. Look out for the deep dive about the Indian independence movement this week as well. Thank you so much for joining.